There is no such thing as digital music or digital photography for that matter. No, it simply does not exist. It's a misnomer, it is a misconception. You can think of it as digital, but digital music and digital photography do not exist. Period. Before I go into the thick of it, let us discuss for a few seconds or few minutes what brought about this curious and unusual statement that some might not find too satisfying or too palatable. Of course, this has been prompted by MoFi Gate, and for those of you who don't know, MoFi, which is short for Mobile Fidelity Sound Labs, is a boutique record company catering mostly to the audiophile public. Audiophile, for those of you who might not know, are people who spend inordinate amounts of money, time, and energy into their stereo systems. And when I say inordinate, I mean large, serious sums of money. About the kinds of money that a serious photographer, not necessarily a professional, but a serious hobbyist photographer would invest in his photo assemblage, let's just say. His entire photography kit or collection, whatever you may call it. So lenses, cameras, tripods, and so on and so forth. And also what a fairly advanced or serious firearms enthusiast or competitor would invest in his firearms. So every hobbyist may, if they have the means, invest large sums of money. So that shouldn't be taken or given as a criticism. But anyway, there are people who invest large amounts of money in their stereo systems. And of course, such people are also interested in better records that sound better, records that have a lot of energy and thought invested in how to make them sound better. So this MoFi company has, since the revival of the vinyl craze about a decade or so ago, a little bit more, has been very vocal about producing very, very high quality records, which they typically do, but they employed a marketing strategy that was very, very deceptive. They made it sound, they never actually said these words, but they made everybody believe and think that their records are purely analog. So when you bought one of their records, you were under the impression that you bought a record that was normally produced up until the mid-80s approximately. So all analog from start to beginning. And sometime this summer, June, July, somebody discovered that they were using a digital file sometime in the process, at a relatively early stage into the process. And of course, from that point on, you cannot, or we don't normally call this an analog or purely analog recording. And now there's even a class action lawsuit. Needless to say, these records don't go for $5-6 in the discount bin in your local record store. They are records that can easily go $75 to $125 a pop. There are iconic recordings such as Miles Davis, Around Midnight, that a lot of people love, and records of that caliber. But not only. So now there is a class action lawsuit against this Mobile Fidelity, and rightly so. I think that basic decency dictates that you shouldn't be dishonest and deceptive, even if it's within the confines of the law. That's a whole other story, one of our ailments of our society, that as long as it's within the confines of the law, it's okay, which it is not. But anyway, so this is what I wanted to talk about and go into really the meat and potatoes of so-called digital or digitalized photography and sound recording, music. So let's take a look at the development of some other aspects or other areas. And let's start with the history of the AR-15. What the hell does that have to do with photography or music? And you know what? Actually, I changed my mind. No, it's a little bit too early in the game, but I promise you there is a stronger than expected connection. Let's talk about music for a second. Music from a historic, conceptual perspective, down to the modern ages. Music has existed almost as long as humanity as a conscious species. Earliest form of music were, of course, religious. So they were parts of rites and worship. There was music in the ancient pagan societies, Babylon, Assyria. Of course, in the Jewish kingdom, the temple in Jerusalem employed music fairly extensively during bringing the sacrifices, which was sort of the daily work of the priest and the center, the epicenter of cultural and religious life. Music served a religious purpose. In fact, we don't really see in those times music in a secular context. When music is in the rare occasions that music is mentioned in the Bible, it is always in a religious context. So psalms and things of like that. You may call the episode with Saul, King Saul, when God starts to disfavor him, and he falls into a foul mood, and he is sad and angry, and he has bad feelings. He calls David to play music for him. So you may say that it's not a purely necessarily religious context, which it might be, but again, in the Jewish kingdom, everything was connected to the religion. So religion encompassed politics and culture and daily life. So it was, even if that was not a 100% specific religious context, it was very closely related to it. In fact, there is a good indication in the Bible. It doesn't say explicitly in the Bible, as far as I can remember, but later commentators say that, and this is one of those commentaries that makes sense, that the prophets, in order to accomplish prophecy, to get into this trance and get into communication with God, they played music. So there is a good indication that this has a strong historic validity. But anyway, so this is how in the ancient cultures music was looked upon, sort of a part of worship and rites. In fact, even to this day, many, if not most, religions have some sort of music accompanying it. Christians for sure. In Judaism it fell out of favor. There's not much music per se in the actual worship, but there is some singing that's not really the religion itself. But anyway, later on, the Greek and Roman empires, there also music began as part of the rite and their worshiping rituals, but it also seeped into culture. There were no concerts the way that we know them today, but in their theaters and sometimes in the sporting competitive events, there was some music as an accompaniment. Of course, the fall of Rome and the formation of Europe and modern Western civilization began with the Dark Ages, where music was all but forgotten or almost forgotten, and it became the lot and the property of the people, of folks. Of course, there was property and death, and not too many people had the leisure to play music, but it lived on as sort of the property, let's just say, of the aristocracy, the gentry, the nobility. Rich noblemen were able to hire troubadours, professional musicians, people who composed and played songs, and then they would send them to play under the window of some woman that they wanted to woo or make her aware of their presence. And so it was a very folkish, popular kind of music which developed. Interestingly, with the Renaissance, there was not immediately a strong and evident revival of music per se. First came the fine arts, painting, sculpture, literature, when Europe rediscovered the Greek and Roman cultures. And a little bit later on, what we know today as classical music, as far as theory and concepts go, started to evolve. And it really started to take off in the 18th, 19th centuries with the great classical composers. Of course, there were precursors like Paganini and earlier ones. But at that point, music split into two different conceptual categories, if you will. So there was the folkish music that you would play at a village fair, and there was in each country they had their own aspect, all different kinds of music. There was Celtic music, of course. There was the Germanic, the Slavic, the klezmer, the Gypsy, the Hungarian, and so on and so forth. So very strong popular connection there, as opposed to classical music, which was something more, let's just say, academic, if not intellectual, that was much more structured. And that's when the great giants of classical music came about. And of course, music kept evolving, kept becoming more modern. We know Stravinsky made a lot of controversial reforms, or not even reforms, just compositions. And then came one Thomas Edison, who invented sound recording. And with that, it became possible to preserve a certain performance, a certain music. In fact, Bartók Béla, Hungarian classical composer, traveled all across Hungary using this new invention. There was still a wax cylinder, and he went all around Hungary and to record and preserve popular music. And he wasn't the only one. Many people did it. In fact, Paco de Lucia did one fairly recently in the 60s and 70s. He traveled all across Spain and recorded folkish music in many Spanish villages. And then, of course, that technology evolved. The gramophone was invented and became available. Of course, not too many people could afford a gramophone, not from a fiscal perspective. Buying the gramophone and just the concept of owning such a piece of machinery, such an apparatus, and having leisure time. People were working, were worn down to the bone. There was poverty, so few people could really afford entertainment for the sake of entertainment. But then, of course, technology improved, society improved. There was little by little improvement. The books of Dickens that you read, you know, Dickens seems to have an obsession with that, but he wasn't wrong. That was a reality, and that was a reality for a big majority of the population, but not 100% of the population. So the upper echelons of population, those who were rich enough to have some leisure time and to purchase these apparatus, they did. And technology advanced, conditions improved, and by the late 40s, the microgroove was invented. And together with this, music also changed on a conceptual level, became more accessible. It became more accessible to make and record music, and it became also easier to proliferate, in other words, to distribute the music, to send it to stores and for customers to pick it up. And people were able to go to different types of entertainment establishments and listen to music, hear music, appreciate music, and music itself changed. There was, of course, Gershwin, who can be considered as sort of a bridge between classical and jazz, if you will, the development of jazz itself. First it was big band, it was what I call boring jazz. One word, boring jazz, because I can't stand it. Django Reinhardt and Armstrong and things of that nature. I just can't touch that thing. But then jazz itself modernized and developed and evolved. But hand in hand with that, with music becoming more accessible and easier to acquire and to produce, of course the quality also inevitably went down. So the popularization of music. Elvis Presley wasn't really a musician proper, he was a performer. There was at the same time the Ventures, which achieved much less fame but had a much more true musical influence on modern popular music. The fact that a lot of people don't mention them notwithstanding, in reality the Ventures had a much bigger influence on actual pop music as just a musical side of things than Elvis. But of course Elvis became the first really big worldwide superstar, and then came more and more let's just say devaluated forms of music, easier, more accessible. The term disposable music was coined or born at a certain time. And by the 60s, 70s, 80s, it was de rigueur that everybody, pretty much everybody, even manual laborers, people who were, for all intents and purposes, were poor, had some sort of music reproducing apparatus, even if not a serious stereo channel, but a cheap stereo channel. So it became accessible to the masses to listen to music and even to produce music. So rock bands sprouted up one after the other, and this kind of music, that kind of music, all different forms of popular music, and there became the notion of being a music star, pop star, rock star became a reality. Beforehand, there was no such thing. What do you want to be when you grow up? Pop star, rock star. The mere notion did not exist. So society changed, the world changed. And of course, in the late 70s, digital technology became available to store, to magazine music, to keep music, and then to later reproduce it. First, the storage was in the form of the recorded music. The actual performance was recorded and stored on a digital medium, but there was no digital playback medium like the CD first. So that music had to be pressed on records, and you got to think to yourself, given the modern analog versus digital debate context, how stupid this concept is. First you digitalize the music, so for the opponents of digitalized music, or the proponents of pure analog music, whichever side of the coin you want to look at, this is the biggest stupidity possible. So first you degrade the music from going from analog to digital, and then you further degrade it by re-analogizing it and pressing it on a vinyl record. But that was the only medium available. And this was in the late 70s. Of course, commercially this wasn't yet significant, but like any technology, it was embryonic. Think of it, in the late 70s, 77 or so, in principle the PC already existed. In reality, it was a pipe dream. It was still a long decade until people would have PCs in their homes. Actually more, until it became completely normative. But the notion of such a modern computer already existed. So this is, in short, the history of music from prehistoric times until the advent of digital music. And so of course now we are still in midst of the big analog versus digital debate. Let's take a look now at photography, which has in many ways a similar path to that of music. But of course, there are big differences. The big difference is that music has existed for millennia, and it was a very well-known form of art and entertainment to mankind for hundreds and thousands of years. It had many different cultural aspects, as we've explained. Photography did not. There was, of course, painting, fine arts, informal painting, drawing, but not actually capturing light on a physical medium and directly reproducing it. So that technology was born approximately 200 years ago, and in its infancy it was very tedious and primitive. One had to coat the glass plate with wet chemicals on the spot, let the light on. It needed long exposures, even in good light, like you can see behind me here. A normal exposure was something like a half hour first, and then improving the chemicals and the processes and the lenses, reduced the time to about half of that, 15 minutes, and then 10 minutes, 5 minutes. And of course, in those times, if you wanted to take a photograph, you had to be a professional. It was just simply inconceivable for an amateur to purchase all that apparatus, to keep the chemicals, to store the chemicals, to transport the chemicals. All of this was tedious, difficult, required knowledge and other specialized accessories, like the transport crates and horse and buggy and whatnot. And of course, technology evolved naturally. The dry plate came by, the film with the silver oxide. First there was something brittle, it wasn't really plastic. And then at the turn of the century, cameras became sort of manageable for average people, or people who would become interested in photography per se. So not necessarily to make a living out of it. Early 20th century. And at that point, when the technology allowed good enough or high enough quality photographs, it also started to evolve into an art. So sort of in this regard, a little bit the opposite of music, right? You could make the case that the art of music evolved from the technology of being able to make musical instruments, but I think in that context it was the opposite. So it was the desire to make music, to satisfy the gods or whatever, to accompany the sacrifices that prompted the creation of musical instruments. I'm not sure this is established fact, but I think that just logic and rationale would indicate to that. Be it as it may, photography started to become a serious occupation, a serious form of art, if not fine art, but a serious form of modern art. And of course, by the second half, around the second half of the 20th century, you had real serious photographers, Bresson, Adams, and so on and so forth. And hand in hand with that, there were developments. I think that the 35mm camera with the cassette that you could self-change, buy more film and bring it to develop was developed some late 20s, mid 30s, something like that. So people were able to purchase cameras and use them. Of course, compared to today of pulling out a smartphone from your pocket and snapping a bunch of snapshots and videos, it was still tedious. But at the time, the serious photographers who used large format and maybe even medium format cameras, they laughed at those who used 35mm cameras as being amateur and low quality and so on and so forth. It's interesting that now in the digital era, kind of the big boys use full frame, which is the same as the 35mm format, which at the time was derided as being small. So here also we see the same concept, that technology evolves, society changes, there is improvement, there is availability. So business, society, economics, technology all work in tandem. You have to look at it as a cycle, as like an organism. that sort of has a life, so to speak. The official storyline of the history of digital photography goes something like one guy, Sassoon at Kodak, tried to make a digital camera in '76. It didn't really work out. It was huge and heavy, and if you wanted to buy such a such an arrangement where you could take photos, that would cost you like twice two average annual salaries. The camera itself, and then the recording apparatus, which had, I think it went to digital, and then it was retranslated to analog for a magnetic tape. And it wasn't really a PC, but it was some sort of a early computer. And of course that didn't work out. And then Kodak shelved the project, and then the Japanese company started to offer digital cameras for sale sometimes in the very late 80s, early 90s, and the public didn't catch on for at least another decade. So the earliest viable, let's just say, good, usable digital cameras came about in the late 90s, something like that. They were available in the early 90s, but very few professionals switched that early, or not entirely. But in the late 90s it was starting to catch on, and by the early 2000s practically everybody switched to digital. I think in 2003 or 4 digital cameras started outselling analog cameras. But there is a little bit more to the story. Of course, the heart of what we term today a digital camera is the light sensor. And in most cases that's going to be a CCD sensor, but it was really preceded by the MOS chipset MOSFET sensor, which was conceived and developed with the infancy of modern computing technology. In fact, the other way around. So there was one Shockley, I think William Shockley or George Shockley, who was a scientist. I think he was a physical and data scientist. But anyway, he was in computers, and he started a small embryonic computing company. Computers, of course, existed since earlier, since the 30s and maybe 40s. But the silicone substrate MOSFET chip did not exist yet, and that's that came about with this character Shockley, who had a couple employees who were not happy. They became dubbed as the Treacherous Eight. Gordon Moore was one of them, if I'm not mistaken, and they went over to one Sherman Fairchild. And this character Fairchild was also an interesting character. He had a lot of businesses, most prominently Fairchild Aircraft, which produced aircraft, of course, government contract, military contracts, and Fairchild Aerial Photography. It was not the same company, but they worked in tandem, of course, and they were both big government and military contractors. So they convinced this this character Fairchild, Sherman Fairchild, to allow them and to invest in them to develop what would become semiconductor. And they really discovered the semiconductor and laid the foundation for, like I said, for the silicon substrate, the modern chip. And that's where really modern computing, the PC, what we know as the powerful circuitry-based and chipset-based semiconductor industry began and developed from there. So they developed the first prototypes of MOS sensors. Some of them fell on the byway because it was not efficient to produce them. So that was part of the whole debacle and the argument with Shockley. But anyway, this is the same Fairchild that provided the CCD sensor to Kodak's camera, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe that wasn't, because those who claimed the Nobel Prize for the light sensor CCD were from Bell. But I'm not 100% sure if they cognizantly and consciously wanted to make a a sensor for photography. I think it was something more general, the photoelectric sensor. But be it as it may, it was mostly the research of Fairchild that laid the foundation for that, both the MOS and the CCDs. And Fairchild actually made the first viable camera that was available. It was not a consumer camera. It was not to take pictures like this of trees. It was an industrial camera for QC, quality observers, quality check. But it came about just about the same time that Kodak didn't go ahead with their digital camera project, maybe a year later, and so it was their camera, and they actually sold it to a manufacturing plant, and that was the beginning of automation, robotics, even AI in embryonic form. But anyway, those cameras were actually functional and they were sold. And that kind of chipset is also the foundation for digital storage of music. So here we are today, and of course when the word switched to digitalized photography or digitally stored photography, everything became a lot easier, everything became much more automated. You don't need to measure for the light and set the aperture and manual focus, and all of that fell by the wayside. Of course, the big dogs, people who had a classical photography education and training, they grumbled and rumbled and said that this is simulated photography and it's shit and it destroyed the business. And yeah, in many aspects it did. Unfortunately, a lot of photographers, a lot of photography shops, a lot of film development studios went out of business slowly. So that's unfortunate. But again, those people maybe they found other businesses. They essentially, not the same individuals, but the employment rate went over to the software and computing world. So now instead of developing film, people are making or trading in or marketing PCs and smartphones and tablets and things of that nature. So yeah, of course there was a hurtful side to the industry, as was for music. I remember early on in the music when the first CD became available, and they were even maybe just talking about it. My father told me, that they're going to completely destroy the music industry. It's not going to be good. And from a certain perspective, he was right. So we spoke a little bit about music, about photography. Let's take a look now at the oft-maligned AR-15. The history of the AR-15 is no less controversial or convoluted than that of digital or digitalized music and photography. The roots of the AR lie in a company called Armalite, which was a division of, guess what? Fairchild Aircraft. That's right. Oh, come on, Joe, you cannot be so cheesy. This is not a real connection. This is just a coincidence. I get it. It's gimmicky, it's cheesy, but there is more than the Fairchild name to the connection of the AR. So this Armalite starts developing the precursor to the AR-15, the AR-10, which was a very revolutionary rifle. If you've seen the first AR-10s and you haven't seen such a rifle before, it was shocking. It was in the very least as shocking as let's just say a traditional photographer seeing a smartphone or a fully automated digital camera, if not more. It didn't look like a rifle. It looked like a toy. The color was absolutely disgusting, horrendous. It looked like something I don't want to mention, but you make it when you have a real bad stomach. I mean, you look at the pictures, you almost can imagine the smell of that. And it looked straight. It looked like what is that famous movie? The Star Wars. It looked like a toy from the Star Wars. Like it just didn't make sense. That's how foreign it was. But mechanically, it was a regular firearm. Needless to say, commercially it tanked. Nobody wanted to buy it. In the military, there was a whole politic. The old dogs didn't want the new rifle, and so the U.S. military was not buying it. Armalite outsourced the production to a Dutch military contractor. I forgot the name right now, but essentially FN, if you will. It wasn't FN, but pretty much the same idea. And they sold a couple thousand. And then they got wind of the fact that the military is changing its mindset regarding firearms and ammunition. They learned some lesson, they conducted some studies, and let's not go into that, okay? Military historians and military and firearm minded guys can argue about this for years, but let's just say that some studies came out, and the thinking heads or the talking heads, the guys with the power, decided that now they don't want to concentrate on long range accuracy, but on short range efficiency. And by short range I mean up to 300 yards, and ease of use, fire rate, how fast it takes from the time that you react, that you need to fire a shot, until you actually get to these ergonomics, weight, and things of that nature. And they were also looking at scaling down the ammunition. And so the military was considering smaller ammunition than what they had as a standard at that time, which was a cartridge called the 308 Winchester, about this size, the entire cartridge, maybe a little bit bigger. But a pinky is a good maybe a little bit bigger, something like this. Yeah, I don't want to give you the wrong finger. That's the approximate size of the 308 cartridge, assembled cartridge with the bullet in it. And as you can imagine, the rifle that carries and envelopes that cartridge, and of course the magazines that accept that kind of cartridge, are kind of big and bulky, and so reducing it to the 5.56, a smaller cartridge, would result in substantial weight and size reduction and savings. And another idea was that an infantry troop would be able to carry more ammunition with them. Whatever you think about it and how flawed these studies were and the conclusions, it doesn't matter. This was the situation, and of course the guys at Fairchild and Armalite got wind of it, and they started to work on a scaled down version of the AR-10. I'm just rambling on. I don't know, this was maybe not even necessary. But anyway, if you open the hood, so to speak, of an AR-15, you will notice that all of the sub-assemblies, all of the parts, all of the concepts even, have already existed prior. So there wasn't even one single new invention inside of the AR-15. So what made it so special, so incredibly different and controversial than other firearms? Well, there is actually one. The central component might have been invented by Stoner, but I'm pretty sure that not. Eugene Stoner is the main architect, designer, engineer, who worked on developing the AR-15 with another one, John Sullivan, who's still alive today. So what makes the AR so special, and what made it all possible? Semi-automatic guns already existed prior to that. The direct impingement system already existed prior to that. There's the Ljungman 42. It's an obscure Swedish rifle, but it was already in use long before the AR-15. In fact, the AK-47 existed. That's a piston impingement, but very, very similar idea. So, before you can understand this, for the benefit of those who do not come from the world of guns, you have to know that the basic principle of all firearms is a closed system. We encase a cartridge into a closed system with only one escape way, which is down the barrel. The bullet is oriented to the middle of the barrel. That's the only way for any energy to escape, and the bullet is trapped inside of the cartridge. It's held there by tension, and you have an assembled unit which is called the cartridge. The bullet plugs the mouth of the case, and there is a combustible, which is today called smokeless powder, and on the close and closest to the shooter there is a tiny amount of explosive, which is the catalyst to the process. And so we stick that cartridge into the beginning of the barrel, which goes the chamber, doesn't matter, and then this is where we got to pay attention. Then we plug the entranceway, what we call the breech, to the barrel, and the plug is professionally termed as a bolt. Until the advent of the AR-15, all bolts, as far as I know, without exception, locked into the receiver. The receiver is the main component, the frame of the firearm. Think of it as the chassis of an automobile, the foundation of the house. So really just a box on which everything else is built. But in a rifle especially, it performs another super important function. It allows the bolt to lock almost hermetically, but yeah, actually hermetically, pretty much, into the barrel. And then once we detonate the primer and the primer ignites the powder, the energy has nowhere to escape but to push the bullet down the bore, and that's how we can accomplish speeds of about 3,000, 2,500, 3,000 feet per second. So about more than double than the speed of sound, at least in the beginning. Of course, the bullet always slows down because it doesn't have its own propellant with it. And so what Stoner did is he invented what is called a barrel extension. Actually, I'm not sure that he invented the barrel extension, but he utilized it such that the bolt locks directly into the barrel extension, or let's just simplify, the bolt locks directly into the barrel. He made it possible. So now, what is the practical implication of this? Now that you do not need to lock the barrel into the receiver stops, the receiver ceases being that component that bears the brunt of that concussion, of that initial tremendous amount of force that ignites, that is created by igniting the powder and pushing the bullet downrange towards the target. So that's really the big merit, the big invention of the AR-15. And now that the receiver does not have to bear and carry the load of shot after shot after shot after shot for thousands of times, it is possible to make the principal component, the central component, meaning the receiver, out of a soft material called aluminum, which is a lot lighter, a lot cheaper most of the time, but most importantly, a lot easier to manufacture, to machine. And so the AR was born, plastic furniture and all. And Stoner and his friends with Sullivan and the development team went and demonstrated this this new gun, this new toy-looking gun, to a very forward-thinking and kind of a humbug, weird type of person, Curtis LeMay, who was the chief of the Air Force, if I'm not mistaken. And they were able to impress him, and he purchased a good number of ARs. Despite that, the AR did not catch on, not in the military, and I think at the time they didn't even think of marketing it to the civilian market. They got into financial difficulties. They didn't want to get funding from the other divisions of Fairchild, and so they just sold the entire thing, lock, stock and barrel, to Colt Firearms. Colt is a traditional American firearms company. They have a lot of experience in dealing with the government and the military, and they took on the project, and they bought everything, the rights to the name, the rights to the design, you name it. And they were able to sell some more to the US military. It became adopted by the military for certain units and certain purposes piecemeal. So some units here, some units there. It saw good extensive service in Vietnam in the late 60s, and it became adopted as a standard issue military firearm in 1970, if I'm not mistaken, give or take a year, maybe two. Despite that, it still did not become the runaway success that it is today. Now let's not forget that the development of the AR-10 started in 54 maybe, and the AR-15 was finalized in 57. It didn't look exactly like a modern AR, but the central component and most of the gun was the same. Of course, there's always improvement in the industry. The machining industry developed incredibly. We have computerized machining centrals. It's called CNC. You write a program and it can start producing high numbers of extremely accurate parts with extreme accuracy, well centered, from barrels. Well, barrels are not really CNC, but other components. And so the manufacturing of the AR was made a lot easier. It was a lot easier to make ARs better, higher quality, more accurate, more reliable, and so on and so forth. In 1977, the utility patent of the AR-15 expired, and other brands were able to legally produce replicas of the AR-15. Of course, the copyrights, the rights to the name, belong to Colt, so Colt is the only one who's allowed to call it an AR-15, but anybody else can copy it centimeter for centimeter, millimeter to millimeter, part to part, and produce the exact same gun. And the truth is that as almost immediately since they acquired it, Colt started pushing it on the civilian market as sort of a frontier gun, range gun. It never really caught on. It started becoming slowly popular in competitions, and some people won competitions with it, and so it ignited more public interest. And in the 80s, of course, with the improvement of the economy, and there was sort of a more conservative and patriotic mindset and atmosphere in the States, so sales went up, more companies started producing it. One of the big advantages, let's just say, or attractions of the AR, that it's easy to customize. You can easily take it apart, buy parts, switch parts, make things that you want. And of course, the availability of these parts and the cottage industries around them started developing. And yet the controversy was nowhere near quieting or slowing down. People were arguing, and people always came to fist. The AR is a piece of shit. It's worthless. It's a mouse gun. It's a jam band. It can't shoot. It can't fire. It jams. It's horrible. It's terrible. And my this and that. My AK-47. That's kind of how they typically compare the two, as two competitors. You know, Corvette versus Mustang. You know, Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, Deep Purple, Black Sabbath. Kind of same idea. They pitted them against one another, and the arguments, of course, never ended. And this fuel just added to the commercial and marketing fire. More ARs were produced and sold, and the numbers always went up. And towards the late 90s, early 2000, it was a bona fide craze. Of course, Clinton's assault weapon ban in 94. 94 also, don't forget, is pretty much the advent of the www, the World Wide Web. And very early on, information became accessible, commerce became accessible. So it really became a craze in the early 2000s. People, of course, PCs became de rigueur in any household. Everybody had a PC, everybody had an internet connection. Information became so much more available. Commerce became so much easier. So that's how the AR exploded, and with it, the controversy of, you know, the old traditional dogs calling the AR a POS and everybody else just buying more and more ARs. There's plenty of people who don't own one AR but 5 or 6 or a dozen, because each one has another cool factor to it, or whatever reason, whatever whatever excuse or reason one has to own another gun. You can never have enough. So if you're an audiophile, think about guns as adding components to your audio chain. If you're a photographer, think about buying another AR, or another component of an AR as buying another lens for your rig. So as you can see from the AR, we don't need to switch from analog to digital in order for something to be controversial, in order for us to have an excuse to beat one another up over one thing or another. You go on all the AR forums, you can see how people start arguing about the smallest minutia. And you can have a quantum leap, so to speak, without going from one technology to the other. So the AR had its kind of quantum leap without a quantum leap in the technology itself. And if you think of it realistically, the big quantum leap was not the change from analog to digital technology, but the change of the storage medium to be available. So the wax cylinder was the real quantum leap. The technology, the conceptual quantum leap. From technology, of course, it had to evolve until it becomes more practical. But digital was just another step in the same direction, in the same succession, and same thing with music and photography. And you see that the same thing happened to the AR-15 without going from digital to analog. In fact, if we were to somehow digitalize firearms, it would work in a very similar way to photography and music, because guess what? You wouldn't digitalize the projectile. That would be a ray gun. So you would be able to buy or steal the X-ray machine from your dentist and somehow point it at your neighbor and fry his brains or give him cancer or something of that nature. Of course, you wouldn't use a lightsaber from the Star Wars, because that's an extremely primitive. It's just a gadget. It's a gag. It's medieval hand-to-hand combat. It's just stupid. So if you really would want to digitize small arms, you would go on the storage medium of the energy. So instead of having a primer and smokeless powder, you would somehow have an electric or electronic actuator, and you could make the firearm much smaller and compact and easier to carry, and you would somehow just load bare bullets without a cartridge into into the chamber. So you would probably have some sort of mechanism that would load tons of bullets and have a digitalized mechanism create that impulse of energy. So there would be a very, very close analogy to digitally stored music and photography. Only the storage medium is digital, but the actual creating and replaying or reproducing of the image or the sound waves has to happen in an analog way, and so would the bullet that flies out of the rifle still be a physical, non-digital bullet. So what are we doing about the initial claim that digital music and photography don't exist? Well, I think I still stand by that. If you remember, really the digital component is only the storage medium. It's easier to visualize it, to understand with the photographic sensor. We call it the digital sensor, but that's a misnomer. The actual sensor, the light sensor, is an electronic sensor, but the process is surprisingly similar to that of film. So the light falls onto the sensor. There's nothing digital yet here. There's nothing yet digital here. And that sensor ignites or actuates the little pixels, or the little light sensitive components of the pixels, and produces the correct light and color reproduction, pretty much very similar to how the human eye works. We have tiny little sensors, photosensitive sensors in our eyes that convert that signal into something that the brain can understand. And science doesn't know what it is till this day. We know what happens until the image is projected onto the eye, and we know that it goes into a nerve, but what happens between that and the visual cortex, nobody knows. Richard Dawkins doesn't know. So nobody knows. And so the electronic photosensor works in a very similar way. The light falls on it, and then it turns it into an electric signal, and then it goes to an AD converter, which converts it into ones and zeros for all intents and purposes. And that's how it works also in music. If you want to record a piece of music, you first have to play the analog piece of music. You can't write it on a computer. In fact, even if you're making music like Kraftwerk, as far as I know, it doesn't go directly to a digital file, but that might be an exception. But again, that's a kind of music, if you want to call it that's conceived from the onset as being computer generated and played by computers. But I think that they play the sounds so that you can hear them. If you can hear the sound, it's analog, it's air moving. If there was a vacuum, you wouldn't hear the sound. And same thing with a photograph. Even if you're looking at a photograph on your computer screen, it's digital until it's on the screen, but on the screen you're looking at an analog image. Yes, it's being reproduced. Yes, it was at a certain point in time 1 and zeros, but it's an analog signal that you are seeing, that your eyes are seeing, that your ears are hearing. So this digital music and digital photography is a misnomer. Today the quality is so high. You can look at photos, and it's very difficult to tell or to claim that a digital photograph is of lower quality than an analog photograph. And even in music, after all of this controversy, Mike Fremer, who is a very, very respected musical guru in the audiophile public, and he's a great guy. I have nothing against him. I love the guy. He's very insightful. His articles are great, everything. But he himself said, this is after the MoFi controversy. This is after discovering that the records that he bought for $125 had indeed a digital components. By the way, for those of you who don't know it, it's simply easier to make the records like this. So there is a master tape which is magnetic, and each time you play it, it has, at least in theory, a degradation. There's some sort of friction going on there, and there is a set amount of records that you can press. So if you want to press unlimited number of records, you have to first convert it to a digital file. So this is what these MoFi guys did. And so anyway, back to this guy Mike Fremer. He said that he took MoFi's word that these records were analog, and that's why he was duped. But he's always the one who claims that you can easily hear the difference between a music that was produced in an analog process from begin to end to a music that's been stored and magazined at a certain point on a digital medium in a digital format. So again, in the early days of digital, I can understand it, but the technology has advanced so much that today practically everything is being recorded. Even if you can hear it, I don't think that you can hear it on a regular basis with all kinds of music, and certainly not everyone. So you have to be at the level of kind of a Mike Fremer, and with the stereo chain, a hi-fi chain that costs $100,000, maybe $200,000 to even appreciate the difference. So practically there's no practical difference. If you prefer the feel of the analog, like I did, a couple of years ago, I dropped my digital camera in the water, and for whatever reason I didn't want to go back into it again, so I bought a cheap analog camera, film camera. I dropped in some film, and when the bug bites me, I'm go ahead and I'm using the film camera. So I don't use it enough to make the price prohibitive for the developing. But again, developing and especially printing today is expensive. And by the way, you can be the most vocal pro analog guy in a 100-mile radius, almost invariably, the film developers, if you order prints, they're gonna scan your negatives and give you prints off of a digital file. So what did you do? Where is the advantage? I get it that sometimes you can say that an image taken on film will have sort of a vintage look or warmth or something. But again, just think about what you're saying. You put that developed negative on a scanner and you scan it, which is the same exact process as pressing the shutter on a digital camera. You're doing the same thing. You're going and you're taking an analog imprint of that negative and you're storing it as a digital file. And the same idea with music. Before you store the music in a digital way, you have to play it. You have to play that piano, that saxophone, that acoustic guitar, electric guitar, double bass, cello, what have you. The sound has to come out of the instrument. The orchestra has to play. Once you record that piece of music, whatever technology you use, whatever microphones, doesn't matter. It has to be combined together, and then with a recording apparatus that translates the analog signal into a digitally stored medium. It makes it into a digital file, and when you retrieve it, when you listen to it again, it has to translate it again. At the end of the day, it has to become an electric signal that's being sent to the loudspeakers, and then you can again enjoy that beautiful piece of music. So that's why I think that for all intents and purposes, there's no such thing as analog or digital music. Of course, it's not an absolute. You want to argue with it, you want to reject this notion, go ahead, it's fine. But I think that even the most ardent pro-analog advocate has to at least acknowledge that in order to appreciate the difference, you have to have a very, very high-end stereo chain and be an expert, like at the level of Steve Huff. Actually, I was watching a Steve Huff video the other day, and he was demonstrating all of his cool, expensive instrumentation, loudspeakers and amplifiers and so. And he himself said that if you want to enjoy, just plain enjoy, he didn't even get into that, he avoided that point of digital versus analog. But it says even if you would just want to enjoy analog music, he was talking about records, so music that's being reproduced analog. That actually brings me into the next point. You would have to invest way more money, so buying the turntable and the tone arm and the cartridge, blah blah blah, should be much more expensive than just a CD player. So there you have it. So I think that today claiming that analog has a clear and undisputed advantage over digital is a very, very dubious claim. And of course, you can claim that I'm a fucking hypocrite because I'm still with my records and my film camera. But number one, I do have a smartphone. I reluctantly got a smartphone a couple of years back, and I use it. I deposit checks, so it's not terrible. I just, when it rings, I don't pick up. It's more the cell phone aspect of it that I don't like. But I snap pictures with it when I need for informal purposes, which was really the the original intent of photography, for informational purposes, to take memories of your family members, of famous people. There was the first portraits, and then for news they took photographs of important events, and so on and so forth. And here's one other thing to remember, which is very, very important. We spoke about the technology making things easier and cheaper and more accessible and more available to the masses, and the overall economic situation and status of most of humanity, at least in the Western world, having more time and money for discretionary spending, which one of its less desirable or more undesirable side effects is the bastardization of art. Right? We went from greats like Schubert, Schumann, Brahms, and Beethoven to to whatever it is that's going on today. I don't know what, not Katie Couric, but I wanted to say Britney something, Britney Spears and Justin Bieber. You get the point. So sort of very, very disposable and plasticky, what a lot of people would call shit music. But we have to remember that this is because of these fakers, if you will, or people who follow the trend or the fashion, that the record came back in the first place. So in the late 80s, when most record companies stopped pressing records, and a decade later the record was practically dead, you had to be a pretty big band like Iron Maiden to insist on your releases to be pressed on vinyl. There was very little vinyl, and then the vinyl died, and then it came back in the 2010 or so because of the hippies and the yappies who didn't even grow up, most of them, with digital music. They just saw that it's cool, and somehow it was a great marketing coup, kind of like single malt Scotch whiskey, which 3 or 4 decades ago, until 3 or 4 decades ago, by the Scots who produced that kind of beverage, was considered an inferior product, an ingredient for normal blended Scotch like Johnny Walker and J&B. And then foreign investors from the United States, from Japan, India, they made money. They were looking into more exotic markets to invest in, and they put the Scotch whiskey in a presentation tube, and they gave it some fancy schmancy name and this years and whatever, and it worked. Today everybody's going crazy about single malt, like it's something special. Originally it was considered a component, not to be consumed by human beings as is. But anyway, I digress here. So this is what happened in 2010. I'm in New York City, and I walk in the street, and I see a big sign. It says Urban Outfitters, and I almost crap my pants. I said, what? New York City? These guys repented? They all of a sudden? I thought, you know what, man, there's kind of a more nature awareness and environment. So I walk in, I don't know how it could have been so stupid, but I was like expecting to see a hunting fishing store, which obviously it wasn't. It was a store for cool people, for yappies, who had whatever the fashion was at the time. I think it was still the super tight jeans that you can't even pull on. And of course there was no fishing rods and no guns and nothing of that sort. So it dawned on me that it was sort of a brand name or something like that. But they had vinyl records. I almost lost my shit. I said, no, I'm going back into this, And I ran back to one of my friends, and I told him, hey, did you know that this vinyl records and this new vinyl records, they're reprinting Van Halen and all kinds of things like that, Michael Jackson and Madonna, like things of the 80s and the 90s. And he said, dude, where have you been living? Under a rock? And I said, yeah, duh. That's where I always live. So thanks to this process, or this phenomenon of on one hand bastardizing and devaluing the worth of art, but these people who go for the more disposable aspect and the fashionable aspects of music, it also came back. So now we can all enjoy vinyls, and vinyl has, in my opinion at least, more appeal, more of a cool, I get it, it's nostalgic and romantic and and kind of sentimental, but if you like it, why not? But I think that trying to make the case for analog only music is silly. And besides, it's not possible to get everything on analog. There's a lot of music, a lot of great music that was never recorded in analog format. From the mid 80s, digital almost became the norm. My favorite artist, Snowy White, from 94 and on, no records were ever pressed. So as far as I know, I don't think that anyone will ever press Snowy White vinyl records, because he's so unpopular and unknown. So few people know about him. And in my opinion, he's the greatest of the great. My first loves were Richie Blackmore and Jeff Beck. I'm majorly into Peter Green and Gary Moore. Snowy White is the second disciple of Peter Green, alongside Gary Moore. But again, I digress here. But in my opinion, he's kind of the number one. But these 5 that I mentioned are definitely, they could share the number 1 spot. But anyway, so this is it, in my opinion. Even and by the way, and one more point, which is a similar point, almost identical, but the mere fact that we can enjoy analog photography and analog music is because we live in a digital world, because of the advent of the semiconductor and the PC and the internet and all of that. Otherwise, it would have no marketing, no commercial value. But now I can call someone, send an email, an instant message, a text over the internet to someone in Kansas or Oregon, and send him my film to develop. They're gonna send it back to me, either over a digital file or the negatives themselves. So we should always remember that no matter how much we can chew out the digital world and its negative aspects, but anyone who enjoys analog things, analog photography, analog music, just remember that you're an analog kid in a world of digital man. Or as James Brown would probably say, it's a digital man's world, but without an analog kid, it would be nothing.